The Second World War was a clash not only of armies and ideologies, but also of machines, steel giants whose roars decided the fate of nations. Among these, few stories are as surprising as that of the Sherman tank and the shock it delivered to German soldiers who faced it for the first time. When the Allies landed in North Africa and Europe, German troops expected the same outdated, clumsy vehicles they had crushed in Poland and France. What they encountered instead was something entirely different, a tank that seemed to think faster, move smoother, and fight with an uncanny coordination that defied traditional warfare. To the Germans, the Sherman was a mystery. It was not the heaviest tank on the battlefield, nor the most powerful, yet somehow it always seemed to appear at the right place and time. Its crews operated with a precision the Germans could not comprehend, striking with deadly accuracy before vanishing behind smoke screens or terrain. What they didn't know was that the Sherman's true strength lay not in its armor or gun, but in its hidden technology, its advanced communication systems, innovative design, and adaptability. Every Sherman was equipped with a reliable radio, allowing entire armored divisions to move like synchronized predators. German panzer crews, still dependent on flags and runners for communication, were stunned to find their maneuvers constantly anticipated and countered. Even more astonishing was how quickly damaged Shermans returned to battle. Their modular construction allowed for rapid field repairs, something unheard of in the rigid German mechanical doctrine. A broken-down Tiger could take days to recover. A crippled Sherman could be back in action within hours. Behind the front lines, an entire industrial machine kept them alive. Factories in America working day and night to ensure that the Allies never ran out of tanks. To German soldiers, it seemed as though the Shermans were multiplying overnight. They destroyed one and two more appeared. The psychological effect was devastating. The Wehrmacht, once confident in its technological superiority, found itself outmatched not by brute force, but by innovation and efficiency. The Sherman's secret technologies, its radio networks, its standardized parts, its cleverly engineered suspension, combined to create something new in warfare, a tank that was part of a living system rather than an isolated weapon. The Germans had built masterpieces of engineering. The Allies had built an army of machines that could think and act together. For the first time, the German armored divisions felt the terrifying weight of inevitability pressing down on them. The Sherman was not a marvel of design, it was a marvel of purpose. And as its engines thundered across the battlefields of Europe, German soldiers realized that they were not just fighting tanks, they were fighting an idea that would reshape modern warfare forever. The winter air of Europe carried a heavy scent of smoke, oil, and iron. The Second World War had become a machine of endless motion, steel grinding against steel, nations crushed beneath the wheels of history. In 1941 and 1942, when the thunder of panzer divisions echoed through France, Poland, and the Soviet plains, the German army believed its armored might was unmatched. The Panzerkampfwagen, the Panzers, were the pride of the Wehrmacht, the iron beasts that roared across Europe and left behind trails of fire and surrender. From the swift Panzer III to the formidable Tiger and Panther tanks, the Germans had created an image of invincibility. The world trembled at the mere sight of their armor. But beneath that aura of dominance, the tide of war was already preparing to turn, slowly and silently. Somewhere in the factories of Detroit, a new kind of war machine was being forged, not born of obsession or perfection, but of practicality and overwhelming numbers. It was the tank that would become the backbone of the Allied armored forces, the M4 Sherman. To the Germans, the idea of the American Sherman was almost laughable at first. Their tank crews, hardened by years of combat and trained under doctrines of precision and superiority, saw Allied machines as crude and clumsy. But as the war expanded and the Allied production lines roared to life, whispers began spreading across the front. Reports from the Eastern Front hinted at new Allied formations appearing with surprising speed and efficiency. Intelligence officers could not understand how the Americans were fielding so many tanks, how entire divisions seemed to rise out of nowhere. What they did not yet realize was that the Sherman was more than a weapon. It was a system, a symbol of industrial strength, adaptability, and innovation hidden beneath its steel skin. By late 1942, when the Shermans first landed in North Africa, the legend of the iron beasts of Europe, the tigers and panthers, was already spreading among German crews. The Tiger I was nearly indestructible in frontal combat, its thick armor and powerful 88mm gun tearing through anything the Allies fielded. German soldiers called it the Königstiger, the king of the battlefield. Its very presence inspired fear. But the Sherman, though smaller and seemingly weaker, began to show up everywhere. Its crews moved fast, communicated effectively, and fought with a strange kind of unity that the Germans did not expect. The desert sands of Tunisia became the proving ground of two philosophies: German engineering perfection versus American mass production. The first clashes between Shermans and Panzers were brutal and confusing. The Shermans were knocked out by the dozen, yet for every one destroyed, another seemed to arrive to replace it. The German commanders noted something unsettling. The Americans never seemed to run out of tanks. The logistical miracle behind this was the heart of the Sherman's secret. Designed to be easy to build, easy to repair, and simple to operate, the Sherman became more than just a vehicle. It became an ecosystem. Its interchangeable parts, modular engine design, and reliable mechanics allowed it to stay on the move while German machines often lay crippled, waiting for rare spare parts that had to travel across a collapsing supply chain. By late 1943, the iron beasts of Europe faced their first true challenger. The Sherman's mobility, combined with air superiority and coordinated tactics, began to show its effectiveness. German tank crews, proud and disciplined, found themselves fighting not individual tanks, but entire networks of communication and coordination. The Americans had developed advanced radio systems that connected tank platoons, artillery, and infantry in real time. This was unheard of in the German ranks, where many tank units still relied on hand signals or colored flags during movement. It was this invisible thread of communication that turned the Sherman into more than a tank. It was a node in a vast war machine driven by efficiency and speed. As the Shermans rolled through Sicily and into Italy, German soldiers began to speak about them with a mix of respect and disbelief. They called them the Green Swarms because they seemed endless, advancing in waves no matter how many were destroyed. The Sherman's secret was not in its armor or gun, it was in its philosophy. It wasn't designed to win a duel with a tiger, it was designed to win the war. And slowly the Germans began to realize that wars were not won by the strongest machine, but by the system that could sustain itself the longest. On the Eastern Front, German tankers had fought against the Soviet T-34, a revolutionary design that had already shocked them with its sloped armor and reliability. But now facing the Sherman, they encountered a different kind of threat. The American machine lacked the T-34's rugged simplicity, but it brought with it the power of logistics and innovation. Its engines roared with dependability, and its mechanical heart could be repaired in the field with ease. Its tracks, often caked in mud and ice, kept turning while German tanks bogged down. The more they studied it, the more they realized that the Sherman was not meant to intimidate, it was meant to endure. German soldiers, trained to worship the mechanical superiority of their tanks, began to struggle with a new fear. They faced not an opponent of equal might, but one of infinite endurance. The Americans seemed to appear everywhere, on beaches, in forests, across river crossings, their Shermans advancing steadily no matter the odds. For every Panzer destroyed, 5 Shermans replaced it. For every Tiger that stood proud, dozens of Shermans encircled it with combined fire and airstrikes. The iron beasts of Europe had met an army that fought with the rhythm of industry rather than the pride of individual craftsmanship. As the war dragged on into its later years, even veteran German officers began to admire the brutal efficiency of the American war machine. In captured letters and journals, they wrote of their astonishment at how fast the Allies could replace losses. The Sherman became the symbol of that unstoppable momentum. It was not beautiful, nor was it perfect, but it was everywhere, and that omnipresence became its true power. In a world defined by scarcity, the Americans had built abundance. In a war where precision had once ruled, the Allies introduced volume, speed, and adaptability. And so, by the time Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the legend of the Sherman had spread across both sides of the front. German soldiers whispered of its endless numbers, its uncanny coordination, and its mysterious communication abilities. The iron beasts of Europe still roared, but the echo of their dominance was fading. The world was learning that the future of warfare would not belong to the heaviest or most fearsome tank, but to the one that could fight, adapt, and return to battle again and again. The dawn of 1942 brought with it a quiet revolution in warfare, one not marked by grand speeches or fanfare, but by the rhythmic pounding of factory hammers and the roar of assembly lines that never slept. Across the ocean, in the industrial heart of America, a machine was being born that would alter the balance of power on the battlefield, the M4 Sherman. Its arrival was not heralded with the prestige of Germany's Tigers or Panthers. It did not boast monstrous armor or terrifying firepower. Instead, its strength lay hidden in something far more potent: reliability, production, and adaptability. When the first Shermans rolled off the docks and into the deserts of North Africa, the soldiers who manned them could hardly imagine that they were sitting inside the tank that would carry them from one end of Europe to the other. To the German forces entrenched in Tunisia, the sight of these olive-green machines was initially unremarkable. Their panzers, battle-hardened and perfected through years of refinement, had cut through Europe like a steel storm. They considered the Shermans nothing more than another Allied attempt to imitate their armored doctrine. But as the days turned to weeks and the clashes intensified, something unexpected began to happen. The Americans didn't retreat. The Shermans kept coming. Destroy one and two more appeared. Knock out a platoon, and a new company replaced it within hours. For every mechanical failure or burned-out hull, a replacement arrived fresh from the ports. German commanders, used to facing enemies who would falter after losing a few armored units, suddenly found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to run out of tanks. It was then that they began to realize that the true power of the Sherman was not in its armor or its gun, but in its overwhelming presence. The Americans had unleashed not just a tank, but a tide. The Sherman's arrival in North Africa changed the rhythm of battle. In earlier years, warfare had been defined by elite units, hand-picked crews, meticulously crafted machines, and highly coordinated maneuvers. But the Americans brought with them a different kind of warfare, one fueled by logistics, standardization, and production. The Sherman was designed not to be perfect, but to be practical. It could be built in dozens of factories, maintained by ordinary mechanics, and operated by soldiers with minimal training. It was a weapon of democracy, a tank built for scale, not spectacle. While German engineers debated over blueprints and fine-tuned their next great weapon, the Americans were already shipping thousands of Shermans across oceans, assembling an iron tide that would soon drown the Axis war machine. In the Tunisian hills, German tank crews soon found themselves facing columns of Shermans supported by relentless artillery and air power. They watched with disbelief as these tanks advanced through terrain that would have immobilized heavier German armor. The Sherman's lighter frame, its wide tracks, and dependable suspension allowed it to move with speed and agility that the massive Tigers could not match. In one engagement near Kasserine Pass, German commanders noted how swiftly the Shermans could reposition after firing, vanishing behind smoke before the panzers could deliver a counterstrike. It wasn't just their speed that surprised the Germans, it was their coordination. The Sherman units operated like clockwork, communicating seamlessly through radio networks that linked tank platoons, artillery observers, and even aircraft above. Where German units still relied on hand signals and line-of-sight communication, the Americans spoke through the airwaves, turning chaos into organized destruction. To the German mind, this was almost alien, a battlefield where information traveled faster than steel. As the Allies advanced deeper into North Africa, German officers began to collect reports from the front. They described Shermans being repaired on the battlefield in mere hours, engines replaced in a day, and entire formations restored overnight. It defied everything they knew about armored warfare. The Tiger, a masterpiece of engineering, required precision maintenance, specialized parts, and skilled mechanics. The Sherman required only tools, spare components, and determination. American tank crews joked that their machines were the tanks that never slept. Even when battered, they found a way to roll again. The psychological impact of this was immense. German soldiers, who had once believed in their mechanical superiority, began to feel the weight of inevitability pressing against them. Every engagement became a battle against numbers, time, and industry itself. The Sherman's arrival represented something far greater than a new tank. It was the physical manifestation of America's industrial might. While the Reich strained to produce a few hundred Tigers a month, the Americans were building thousands of Shermans. Each factory worker back home became an invisible soldier on the front lines, forging steel that would roll into the heart of Europe. The Germans could destroy a dozen Shermans in a day, but the Americans could replace them by nightfall. This was a war of endurance, and the Sherman was endurance made manifest. By mid-1943, the desert battles had given way to new theaters of war, Italy and the European mainland. The Sherman became the face of the Allied advance, its silhouette etched against the backdrop of ruined towns and scorched fields. For many German soldiers, their first sight of the Sherman came through the haze of smoke and gunfire as it rolled relentlessly forward, seemingly indifferent to losses. They nicknamed it Tommy's Tractor, mocking its shape and simplicity, but secretly they feared its persistence. Wherever there was a Sherman, there were always more. It was not one enemy. It was an army of steel, an organism of war that refused to die. The Germans soon discovered that the Sherman's greatest secret lay in its versatility. Engineers had designed it with adaptability in mind, allowing rapid modifications for different combat needs. Within months, variants appeared with flamethrowers, mine-clearing gear, rocket launchers, and bridge lane systems. The most feared of all was the Firefly, a British modification armed with the powerful 17-pounder gun, capable of piercing even the armor of a Tiger I from long range. When the first Fireflies appeared on the battlefield, German tankers were stunned. The very machine they had dismissed as inferior was now capable of killing their most prized tanks. From then on, German tank commanders were ordered to prioritize destroying Fireflies first, proof that the once laughed-at Sherman had become a serious threat. But it wasn't just their firepower that made the Sherman formidable. It was the way it worked as part of a larger system, a symphony of coordination. Every Sherman crew was connected by radio, every tank supported by artillery, and every advance covered by airstrikes. The Americans didn't fight individual battles, they orchestrated them. For the German soldiers, used to decentralized command and situational improvisation, this was disorienting. They faced an enemy that didn't react emotionally to loss, that didn't hesitate or retreat when a platoon was destroyed. Instead, new waves of Shermans would appear, guided by precise communication and supported by logistics that seemed infinite. It was as though the Americans had removed emotion from war and replaced it with calculation. In battle reports recovered after the war, German officers wrote about their bewilderment at how fast the Americans could adapt. When terrain changed, the Shermans were modified. When tactics failed, new ones were immediately tested. The Sherman was not a single design, it was an evolving concept. Its mobility allowed it to cross rivers, climb hills, and fight in city streets where heavier tanks could not operate. Each campaign, from Tunisia to Sicily, from Italy to France, reshaped the Sherman into a more lethal, more efficient version of itself. The Germans were used to innovation being a matter of genius and invention. The Americans made it a matter of iteration and production. Every failure taught them something, and every lesson became a new variant rolling off the line. As the Shermans poured into Europe, German propaganda struggled to explain the growing imbalance. They painted the American tanks as weak and inferior, insisting that German technology remained unmatched. But on the battlefield, soldiers saw the truth. They saw endless columns of Shermans advancing across open plains, their turrets turning in unison, their engines humming like a single organism. The roar of the Tiger was loud, but the march of the Sherman was endless. Its presence demoralized even seasoned panzer crews, who began to realize that the old rules of war no longer applied. This was not a contest of machines. It was a test of nations, of systems, of endurance. And in that contest, the Sherman had no equal. By the time Allied forces stormed Normandy, the arrival of the Sherman was no longer a surprise. It was an inevitability. German defenders along the Atlantic Wall braced themselves for the invasion, but nothing could have prepared them for the sheer volume of tanks landing on the beaches. The Shermans came ashore under fire, some destroyed before their treads even touched the sand, yet the waves behind them never stopped. Engineers, medics, and tank crews worked side by side, turning chaos into progress. The German soldiers watching from the cliffs saw something they could hardly believe. Destruction had no effect on momentum. The Americans did not slow down, did not retreat. They advanced, rebuilt, and advanced again. The Sherman had become a force of nature. In every sense, its arrival marked the beginning of the end for the German dream of domination. The tank that was once mocked now symbolized inevitability. It was the hammer of industry pounding at the gates of Europe, a mechanical embodiment of the Allies' will to win. The German iron beasts still prowled the fields with terrifying power, but they could no longer hold back the tide. Every Sherman destroyed became part of a larger rhythm: replace, reload, return. By late 1944, the Germans understood that the Sherman was not just a tank, it was the future. A future built not on perfection, but on persistence. Its arrival had transformed the very nature of war, from battles of prestige to battles of production, from duels of strength to struggles of endurance. And as the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, the Germans could only watch as their iron beasts met an enemy that did not fear death, because death itself had become part of its design. The Sherman had arrived, and with it came a new era, one where the weight of industry crushed the dreams of empire beneath its endless tracks. When the Sherman first rolled across the battlefields of Europe, most German soldiers assumed they understood its design. They saw its rounded turret, its medium armor, its 75mm gun, and dismissed it as another mass-produced tank built for quantity rather than quality. But beneath the rivets and welded steel lay a series of secrets that made the Sherman far more dangerous than it appeared. It wasn't the thickest nor the most heavily armed, but its internal design, engineering foresight, and battlefield adaptability made it the true backbone of the Allied armored divisions. The secret inside the steel was not just metal, it was philosophy. The Sherman was designed with one goal: to fight anywhere, anytime, under any condition. From the deserts of North Africa to the snow-covered fields of the Ardennes, its construction allowed for quick repairs, modular replacement, and global production. Inside, every bolt and lever had been positioned for efficiency. American engineers had studied countless battle reports, understanding that a tank's true strength was not just in its firepower, but in its survivability. The Sherman's designers built it to keep its crew alive, to allow them to fight again, and that principle made it one of the most effective machines of the war. While the German Tiger's thick armor could shrug off direct hits, a single mechanical failure could immobilize it for days. The Sherman, lighter and simpler, could be patched together with field tools and scrap metal. Its radial engine, borrowed from aircraft technology, was a marvel of reliability, capable of running in heat, mud, and snow without choking. Its transmission system was simple enough for even inexperienced crews to maintain, and its standardized parts meant that a destroyed tank could serve as a donor for others. German engineers, obsessed with perfection, could never have imagined such practicality. Captured Shermans were examined by German mechanics who were astonished by how easy they were to operate and repair. They found features that, while unglamorous, revealed a deep understanding of war's realities. Fireproof fuel tanks, quick-release hatches, and a rotating turret mechanism that could function even with minor damage. The Sherman was not a luxury machine. It was a soldier's machine. It valued the lives inside it more than the metal outside. This philosophy became clear on the battlefield. Many Sherman crews who survived direct hits credited their tank's design for saving them. Unlike the claustrophobic interiors of German tanks, the Sherman's cabin allowed for easier escape. In countless accounts, crews recalled bailing out through top hatches as their tanks burned, surviving because the engineers had thought ahead. This focus on human survival gave the Allies an invisible advantage. Veteran crews gained experience battle after battle, while the Germans often lost theirs inside their armored tombs. By mid-1944, as the Allies pushed through France, the secret inside the Sherman steel became undeniable. Its efficiency in repair, communication, and adaptability made it a cornerstone of Allied victory. To the Germans, who once laughed at its simplicity, it had become a terrifying symbol of unstoppable momentum. A machine that refused to die, not because of its armor, but because of the brilliance hidden within its design. The night was alive with whispers of engines and the faint rumble of distant artillery as the Allied armor prepared for the next great push. Among the legions of Shermans that lined the hedgerows of Normandy, a new and deadly variant had begun to earn a name whispered with both pride and fear: the Firefly. It was not a name born of romanticism, but of raw power. For this tank's cannon could light up the night sky with a flash so brilliant that it seemed to tear darkness itself apart. The British engineers who had modified the standard Sherman had achieved what many had deemed impossible. They had given it the power to kill a tiger. The 17-pounder gun that protruded from the Firefly's turret was longer, heavier, and deadlier than anything the Germans had imagined an Allied tank could carry. For years, the Panzer crews had ruled the battlefield with confidence, their armor nearly invincible to most Allied guns. But that confidence began to waver the moment Fireflies rolled into combat. The first encounters were almost mythic in their suddenness. German tank commanders reported seeing flashes of light in the darkness. Fireflies, they thought at first, only to watch in horror as their own tanks erupted in flames moments later. It was a cruel irony that the British had named their creation after a creature of light, for its glow often signaled death for those who faced it. Each Firefly carried the mark of a transformation in Allied warfare. Where once the Allies relied on numbers to overwhelm, they now wielded precision and lethality. In the black fields of France, these tanks became silent hunters, stalking the giants that had once terrorized Europe. A single Firefly could change the tide of a skirmish, and German crews soon learned to fear even the faint glint of its barrel under moonlight. The Allies had learned from bitter experience that brute force was not enough. They needed to adapt, to innovate, to strike back with intelligence as much as strength. The Firefly embodied that spirit, a fusion of American engineering and British ingenuity that redefined armored combat. The transformation was not only mechanical but psychological. For the first time, Allied tank crews could face the Tigers and Panthers without dread. No longer did they feel like prey. They had become predators of the night. In ambush after ambush, Fireflies proved their worth, often lying in wait while regular Shermans drew enemy fire. Then, when the German tanks revealed their positions, the Firefly would unleash its devastating shot, turning the hunter into the hunted. German reports began to note strange patterns in battle. Entire armored platoons wiped out without understanding what had hit them. They called it the ghost gun, a weapon that struck unseen and vanished into the dark. The once invincible aura surrounding the Tiger began to crack, not because it had become weaker, but because its enemies had grown smarter. The Firefly's presence forced the Germans to rethink their tactics. They could no longer dominate from long range. They now had to fear that every hedgerow concealed a killer. As the Allies advanced deeper into France, the legend of the Firefly grew. Crews began decorating their tanks with nicknames: Black Flash, Starlight, Hell's Glow. To them, the Firefly was more than a machine. It was revenge made steel, a promise that the days of German supremacy were over. The battles around Caen and the Falaise pockets cemented its reputation. In those deadly fields, the Firefly proved it could stand toe-to-toe with the mightiest tanks of the Reich. German commanders ordered their troops to target Fireflies first, but spotting them was easier said than done. Their long barrels were often camouflaged, their positions carefully chosen, their shots devastatingly accurate. A single well-placed Firefly could hold off an entire column of German armor, buying precious time for infantry to advance or for air support to arrive. The Allies, once masters of armored warfare, now faced an enemy that understood them too well. Every weakness in their tactics, every flaw in their designs, the Allies had studied and exploited. The Firefly became a symbol of that knowledge turned into power. It was not the most numerous nor the fastest, but it was the most feared. And as the summer of 1944 turned to autumn, the Firefly's light continued to burn across the night skies of Europe, guiding the Allied march toward victory. For the men who fought inside them, the Firefly was both a weapon and a guardian. Its thunderous recoil, its searing muzzle flash, and its ability to strike down even the mightiest foe gave them a sense of control amid chaos. They had become equals on the battlefield, no longer running from shadows cast by German steel. And in that newfound confidence, a new chapter of the war was written, one in which courage, innovation, and the relentless pursuit of progress illuminated the darkest nights of history. War, at its heart, is not only about weapons and men, it is about information. The ability to know before the enemy knows, to move before the enemy moves, and to strike before the enemy strikes. For years, the German war machine had thrived on its mastery of command and control, using blitzkrieg's speed and coordination to outthink and outfight its opponents. But as the tide turned and the Sherman tank became the armored backbone of the Allied forces, a new and invisible weapon emerged to tip the scales: communication. Hidden within the steel belly of every Sherman was a technological advantage so subtle that many German commanders failed to understand how devastating it truly was. Each Sherman came equipped with a radio system that connected it not only to other tanks, but also to infantry, artillery, and even aircraft overhead. This was not merely a convenience, it was revolution. The American and British forces had created a networked army where every unit, no matter how small, could share what it saw, heard, and planned. On the surface, the battlefield appeared chaotic: explosions, smoke, and confusion. But beneath that chaos pulsed a steady rhythm of communication, invisible to the eye, yet decisive in its impact. The Germans, for all their mechanical brilliance, still relied heavily on visual signals, runners, and limited radio coordination between units. Their tanks, especially early models, often lacked efficient communication links, forcing commanders to rely on flags or prearranged plans. This meant that once a battle began, flexibility vanished. By contrast, the Shermans operated like a living organism, constantly adjusting, responding, and adapting to the flow of combat. In every engagement, the difference became more evident. A German panzer platoon might outgun a Sherman formation, but once their leader was taken out, confusion spread like wildfire. The Shermans, however, could lose their commander and continue fighting with seamless coordination. Orders passed instantly through the radio waves: change formation, flank left, call artillery, request air cover, and within seconds, the battlefield shifted in their favor. What had once been a reactive army now moved with foresight and precision. To the Germans, it felt like fighting an enemy with eyes everywhere. The first major demonstration of this communication edge came during the push across France. As the Allies advanced through the narrow hedgerows, visibility was limited, ambushes frequent, and confusion constant. Yet, while German tanks struggled to coordinate in the maze-like terrain, Sherman crews called out targets, guided infantry, and directed airstrikes with uncanny efficiency. A hidden radio call could summon fighter bombers from miles away to obliterate an entrenched position or redirect artillery fire to suppress a tiger's advance. It was warfare not of brute strength, but of interconnected minds. American and British forces had, without realizing it, pioneered the first truly modern battlefield network. To a Sherman crew, the radio was as vital as the gun. Every member understood its power. Commanders would lean close to their microphones, voices calm amid chaos, guiding their men through storms of steel. They could speak not only to nearby tanks, but to headquarters miles away, receiving new objectives or reporting real-time updates. It gave the Allied army an elasticity the Germans could never match. When a tiger appeared, they didn't panic. They called it in, relayed its position, and coordinated a response. When ambushed, they didn't retreat blindly. They radioed artillery, who answered with thunder. It was a form of warfare the Germans had never faced before, dynamic, collective, and intelligent. In the desperate counterattacks that followed the Normandy invasion, German officers repeatedly complained that their enemies moved with unnatural coordination. They could not understand how scattered Sherman units always seemed to know where the fight was thickest or when to strike from the flank. They called it luck, but it was not luck. It was communication. The radio transformed the Sherman from a mere machine into a node of a vast, living network. Each crew, no matter how isolated, was part of something larger. In this invisible web, information became ammunition. One of the most famous examples came during the breakout from Saint-Lô, where an entire German armored column was trapped and destroyed not by superior firepower, but by superior coordination. Sherman commanders communicated their positions and targets in real time, calling in fighter bombers and artillery with pinpoint precision. In hours, what could have been a prolonged slugfest turned into a massacre. German survivors described it as fighting ghosts, enemies that knew every move before it was made. By late 1944, the communication edge was no longer just a tactical advantage, it had become a philosophy. Allied commanders began to build strategies around this new networked warfare. Patton's rapid advance across Europe was made possible by this invisible infrastructure of radio-connected units. While the German High Command waited for reports, Patton's men were already executing new orders transmitted directly through the air. Speed and information replaced rigidity and hierarchy. For the first time in history, warfare moved at the speed of sound. The German officers captured later in the war often spoke of their frustration. They had superior tanks, brilliant tacticians, and experienced crews, but they were blind in comparison to the Allies. They fought as individuals, while the enemy fought as one mind. Even the most formidable tiger could not outshoot a coordinated team of Shermans who could call in reinforcements, coordinate crossfire, and maneuver as if choreographed by a single hand. Every loss they inflicted on the Allies seemed meaningless, for the network remained intact and the Shermans kept coming. This hidden communication edge extended beyond the battlefield. Behind every tank was a supply network that could adjust instantly to changes in need. Fuel shortages, ammunition demands, mechanical breakdowns, all could be reported and resolved faster than the Germans could even react. The Sherman, once mocked for its simplicity, had become the beating heart of an army that operated like a machine of precision and purpose. Its radios were the veins through which flowed the lifeblood of modern war: information. As the winter of 1944 descended and the Battle of the Bulge erupted, the German army tried once last time to reclaim initiative. In the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, they launched their surprise offensive, cutting off Allied units and sowing confusion. But even in the chaos, the Sherman crews held together, their radios crackling with messages that refused to let isolation turn into defeat. While German tanks advanced under the cover of fog, Allied units maintained contact, coordinating artillery fire and ambushes even when surrounded. The power of communication turned near disaster into defiance. For the Germans, who believed they had achieved surprise, the realization was bitter. No matter how deep they penetrated, no matter how fierce their assault, the Allies could regroup within hours. Orders, intelligence, and morale all flowed through the unseen ether that bound them together. The German advance slowed, then stalled, crushed under the combined weight of coordination and resilience. By the time spring returned, the Allied network had grown unstoppable. Every Sherman on the field, from the muddy roads of Belgium to the streets of Cologne, was a part of a grand orchestra of steel and signals. The Germans, for all their discipline and engineering, could never replicate that harmony. Their tanks fought as isolated warriors. The Shermans fought as a united legion. When historians would later look back, they would see that the true secret of the Sherman's success was not its gun, nor its armor, but its voice. It spoke across miles, connecting men, machines, and strategy in a way that redefined warfare. In that hidden frequency, in those bursts of static and coded words, the future of combat was born. A future where information would always triumph over isolation and communication would prove mightier than steel. By the winter of 1944, the tides of war had begun to shift irreversibly. The once invincible German war machine was faltering under the relentless pressure of Allied advance, and in that great turning point, the Sherman tank stood as both symbol and instrument of change. From the deserts of North Africa to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the humble M4 had evolved from a subject of ridicule to the cornerstone of liberation. The soldiers who drove them no longer doubted their machines. They trusted them, for they had carried them through storms of steel and fire and had survived. Across Europe, the thunder of Allied armor grew louder, echoing through ruined towns and broken plains, a sound that told every German soldier that the end was coming. The Sherman had matured into a weapon of momentum, and the Allies wielded it with unmatched precision. In the days following D-Day, as the hedgerow fighting turned into open warfare, the Shermans came into their own. They poured through Normandy like a steel flood, their engines roaring as they broke through German defensive lines that had seemed impregnable. The key was coordination. Each tank was no longer a lone warrior, but part of a living, breathing organism. Infantry, artillery, and air support moved in perfect synchronization, all tied together through radio communication, a luxury the Germans could scarcely afford. Every time the Wehrmacht tried to regroup, they found the Shermans already waiting, cutting off supply lines, ambushing retreating convoys, and smashing counterattacks with mechanical determination. The tide was not just turning on the battlefield, it was turning in spirit. For years, German soldiers had fought believing they were the masters of armored warfare, but now they faced an enemy that had learned every lesson they had taught. The Allied commanders, once cautious, now advanced with the confidence of inevitability. The Sherman's adaptability had become its greatest weapon. It had transformed from a simple medium tank into a platform of innovation. Engineers had modified it to carry flamethrowers for clearing bunkers, bridging equipment to cross rivers, and even rocket launchers for anti-infantry assaults. In one sector, entire platoons of Shermans were converted into recovery vehicles to drag damaged comrades off the field, ensuring that no machine was left behind for the enemy. This logistical brilliance ensured that the Allied spearhead never lost momentum. Meanwhile, German production was collapsing. The once mighty Tiger and Panther tanks, though superior on paper, had become victims of their own complexity. They broke down often, consumed vast amounts of fuel, and required specialized maintenance. The Sherman, simple and reliable, thrived in contrast. It was not the strongest, but it was the most enduring, and endurance was what won wars. The Battle of the Bulge proved this truth beyond all doubt. In the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, the Germans launched their last desperate counteroffensive. Tigers and Panthers surged forward, cutting through the thin Allied lines. But the Shermans, caught off guard, did not crumble. They regrouped, adapted, and counterattacked with a ferocity that stunned even veteran German commanders. Despite the freezing cold, despite fuel shortages and shattered supply routes, the Shermans kept moving. Their engines roared back to life in the snow, their tracks grinding forward, where even half-tracks had failed. When German armor began to falter from lack of fuel, the Shermans pounced. They fought not for glory, but for survival, and in that grim determination lay their strength. The turning of the tide was not marked by a single victory, but by the relentless accumulation of progress. Each mile the Shermans advanced, each bridge they crossed, each town they liberated, added to the momentum that Germany could no longer resist. From Bastogne to the Rhine, the story was the same. The Allies advanced because they refused to stop. And wherever they went, the Sherman led the way, its tracks leaving scars of freedom on occupied soil. German soldiers began to speak of the Shermans with a mix of hatred and awe. They called them rolling death, not because of their might, but because they never stopped coming. When one was destroyed, another appeared. When a platoon was wiped out, a new one took its place. It was industrial warfare in its purest form. Quantity had become quality. Even the skies seemed to favor the Allies. The close cooperation between tank crews and fighter bombers created a new dimension of warfare the Germans could not counter. P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons swooped down to strike at German columns, guided by Sherman spotters on the ground. Each engagement was a deadly dance of coordination, where the Sherman acted as both eyes and hammer of the Allied advance. The Germans, once feared for their tactical brilliance, now found themselves overwhelmed not by superior tactics, but by superior systems. The Sherman's radio became as vital as its gun, turning chaos into order. For the first time in history, an army fought not as isolated units, but as a networked force, communicating faster than the enemy could react. The tide had turned because the Allies had mastered not just warfare, but war's machinery. production, logistics, communication, and morale. As 1945 dawned, the Sherman spearheaded the final assault into the heart of Germany. Through the shattered remains of the Siegfried Line, across the icy Rhine, the tanks rolled like a river of vengeance. Civilians watched from broken windows as columns of Shermans rumbled through towns, once draped in Nazi banners, now littered with surrendering troops. The very sight of the American star painted on their hulls became a promise of liberation. German officers, who once scoffed at the inferior Allied tanks, now surrendered before them, knowing resistance was futile. The Sherman had outlasted them all. The tide had not only turned, it had washed away the empire of fear that had engulfed Europe. By April, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin, the Sherman's role as a destroyer gave way to that of a liberator. Its tracks crushed the remnants of tyranny beneath them, rolling past cheering crowds who saw in the tank not destruction, but deliverance. The machine that had been born of necessity had become a symbol of freedom. The turning of the tide was complete, not just on maps and battlefields, but in hearts and histories. The war that had begun with lightning and terror ended with endurance and willpower. And at the center of that story was the Sherman, unassuming, unstoppable, unforgettable. Its legacy was not forged in the brilliance of a single moment, but in the persistence of countless ones. It taught the world that perfection was not power, persistence was. And when the guns finally fell silent and the world began to rebuild, the Sherman remained a reminder of what humanity could achieve when it refused to yield to darkness.